Good morning, Rowan. It's the 27th of January 2016 and it's 7:15 in the morning and we're nearly out of the Madrugada. I don't know what time the sun rises, but anyway, I'm going to make some more comments about your astonishing lecture at the Royal College of Medicine, which you gave on the 21st of July 2015 and was entitled Sexuality, Sexual Health and Religion Today. So without further ado, I'll make some more comments about what you say. So you say, it's often said that the other Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Islam, don't have quite the same problem as Christianity has about the body, and that's largely true. Judaism and Islam are less fastidious and anxious, less fussed about the body and passion than Christianity is, for a number of reasons, which would take a long time to spell out. In fact, you don't spell out a single reason. You don't even list any reasons. You don't give a single reason. So this is another one of your impressionistic statements that's intended to make you seem very learned. So you go on to say, they don't have any deeply entrenched worry about the physical as such, and they don't seem so worried about letting go, about passion. So the positive valuation of sexual desire and sexual passion is very, very deeply there in lots and lots of Jewish writing and Islamic writing. So here again we've got another impressionistic statement, because you don't quote any of this alleged Jewish and Islamic writing. You don't name a single source. So you're giving the impression here that you've read lots and lots of Jewish writing and Islamic writing, but I can't see any evidence that this thing that you've implied is true. Why haven't you named an example of such writing, if there is one, and if indeed you've read it? So, yet again, more impressionism. So you go on to say, the ideal of celibacy and the ideal of rational control of your sexuality are not given the same valuation in Judaism and Islam. Well, it's true that celibacy as a lifelong vocation, as a lifelong choice, doesn't really exist in Judaism and Islam, and it does in certain strands of Christianity, and historically it certainly did. So that's true, but then on the other hand, it doesn't mean that celibacy has no value at all in Judaism and Islam, because people who are not married are expected to be celibate according to the teaching of Judaism and Islam. So the only people who are not celibate are people who are married to a spouse of the opposite sex. All other people would be expected to be celibate. So you go on to say, the downside, because there's no such thing as a free lunch here, the downside is that in some ways Jewish and Islamic approaches to sexuality are more deeply wedded to patriarchy and reproduction than Christianity has been. Well, this is quite interesting, isn't it, that you view it a downside, that approaches to sexuality are more deeply wedded to patriarchy and reproduction than Christianity has been. Well, firstly, that isn't true, is it really? Because what we might call the sexual revolution in the West has only been in evidence for really a maximum of 100 years, and really was only more prominent from the 1960s. So up until that time, approaches to sexuality were very deeply rooted to patriarchy and reproduction in the West, and in fact Western Christian culture has been deliberately undermined. And the other factor is, I'm very interested that you consider being deeply wedded to patriarchy a negative thing, because the implication there is that you think that women are oppressed by patriarchy. So this is a bit like your championship of the poor, isn't it? Because you think that the poor are oppressed by capitalism, and poor people need elites like you. You think you're elite anyway. Intellectuals like you. People who are more intelligent and sophisticated and learned. Poor people need people like you to liberate them from capitalism, and women need people like you to liberate them from patriarchy. Well, this is very interesting, isn't it? Because what happens when you actually meet a poor person, when you actually meet a woman? What happens when you meet a poor woman? Do you liberate this woman from patriarchy and capitalism? No, you don't, do you? You try to screw her, and then you spend decades trying to utterly destroy her. So it's quite hard for me to believe that your interest in liberating women from patriarchy has an altruistic cause. Anyway, I'd really appreciate it if you could stop trying to liberate me. Because I never felt more oppressed than I've felt oppressed by you, so please stop liberating me. I can't cope with any more liberation. Anyway, you go on to say, Christianity, in spite of what some people say in the Daily Mail, is not all about family values. In fact, early Christianity is often pretty sceptical about families. Well, there's two things to say about this. I mean, the Daily Mail is a relatively popular newspaper that is more politically right-leaning than the majority of other newspapers that you'd find in Britain. And it's a very popular target for pseudo-intellectuals like you, Rowan, to be having a snipe at when you've probably never even read it once and have no idea what it says. So you were sniping at Donald Trump before Christmas without being specific about something that he said that you found objectionable. You were sniping at me on my YouTube channel, or getting someone else to do it, just attacking my personality, an ad hominem argument, because you haven't got an argument to criticise the comments I'm making about the things that you say and do. And here you are, sniping at the Daily Mail, which I'm not defending, by the way, because I don't read it and I've no idea what it says. But you're sniping at the Daily Mail and you're not giving any example of what you consider to be objectionable about it. It's just a popular target for left-wing pseudo-intellectuals who want to gain the approval of their peers. So, you're too elitist to read the Daily Mail. It's not that you're too intellectual or the Daily Mail writes anything bad or anything like that, which I'm not qualified to comment on what the Daily Mail writes anyway, but I do know that it's a very popular target for pseudo-intellectual communists like you. Anyway, then you also say, I'll read it all again. Christianity, in spite of what some people say in the Daily Mail, is not all about family values. In fact, early Christianity is often pretty sceptical about families. Well, that's not really true either. Family life is promoted in the New Testament. It's also promoted in Judaism in the Old Testament. It's true that St. Paul advocated celibacy for people who felt able to live a celibate life. and that Jesus said that no one should prefer members of their family to following him. So that's true, but to say it's sceptical about families, that isn't true really. I mean, Jesus was born into a family, obviously, and they took care of him as he was growing up. And St. Paul talks about relationships within the family, how they should be, and how children should be raised. So to say that early Christianity is sceptical about the family, I just think it's complete nonsense, really. Celibacy is promoted in the New Testament, but not to the exclusion of family life, certainly not. Anyway, you go on to say, it doesn't necessarily have a huge investment in keeping the human race going. This is Christianity that you're talking about. Well, no, the purpose of human life for Christians isn't keeping the human race going. It's pleasing God and hopefully inheriting eternal life. So that's the purpose of Christian life, not keeping the human race going. But that doesn't exclude the possibility of keeping the human race going. So you go on to say, Judaism and Islam are much more interested in procreation, the reproduction of the race, for all sorts of reasons. But that can mean, in lots of Jewish and Islamic approaches, it can mean what some people call by the terrifying title of heteronormativity. That is, heterosexual reproductive sex is the only thing. And you say that this attitude, heteronormativity, that might be harder to shift in the context of Judaism or Islam than it might be in Christianity. So this is very interesting, isn't it, Rowan? So you're setting out your agenda here, that one of the things that is important that we do is we shift the ideal of heteronormativity. So heteronormativity is a bad thing. And Judaism and Christianity and Islam, Judaism and Islam, it's going to be harder to shift heteronormativity than it is going to be to shift it in Christianity. This is what you're saying. Well, this is quite interesting, isn't it? Because what's your main agenda then? You know, because if you're a Christian, you want to serve God and do what God wants and live by the teaching and example of Christ and all this kind of thing. Now, some people who would identify themselves as Christians interpret that to mean that the church should be more including of gay lifestyles, basically, or at least gay lifestyles that resemble marriage, like lifelong faithful unions and that kind of thing. So those people would say, well, we're being faithful to Christ in living this way because we think this is what he would have done. But you're not saying that, are you? You're saying that your agenda is to shift the ideal of heteronormativity, and this clearly isn't because you think that this is according to the teaching or example of Christ. You don't even believe that. It comes out in this statement. You don't even believe that, because you then go on to say how it's going to be harder to shift this ideal of heteronormativity in Judaism and Islam than it might be in Christianity. Well, why would you be trying to shift it in Judaism and Islam anyway? If you're not a Jew or a Muslim, then what interest do you have in shifting the religious teaching of Judaism and Islam to eliminate heteronormativity, or anything else for that matter? It's got nothing at all to do with you. So your real agenda is not living according to the teaching of an example of Christ, even by interpreting that in a very liberal way. That's not your agenda. Your agenda is shifting the ideal of heteronormativity and that extends even to other religions which have nothing to do with you. It's very strange as well, isn't it, that you should be so dedicated to shifting this ideal of heteronormativity in Christianity and other religions. You're so dedicated to that, but for some reason it was an absolutely enormous issue. You were absolutely obsessed with going around behind my back for over a decade, freaking out, allegedly, that I just might be a lesbian. So that's a bit strange, isn't it, that you should be so committed to shifting this ideal of heteronormativity, as you've termed it, and that heterosexual reproductive sex is not the only thing. Yet it was a cause for obsession and hysteria, allegedly, that you allegedly believed that I might be a lesbian. So why would you care about that if you wanted to shift heteronormativity anyway? That's a bit strange, really, isn't it? Heteronormativity. I don't even know what that means, to be honest. I've not heard it before. Heterosexual reproductive sex is the only thing. Well, it doesn't. Heteronormativity doesn't imply that to me. What it implies is that heterosexuality is more normative than homosexuality, which it is because more people are heterosexual than homosexual. So I haven't looked it up, but I don't know what heteronormativity means. But I would say that it's more usual for a person to be heterosexual than homosexual. So you go on to say, I don't know, but that's one way of looking at it. So you don't know that for certain that it would be harder to shift heteronormativity in the context of Judaism or Islam than it might be in Christianity. So you go on, simply to say that although Judaism and Islam have on the surface a more positive appreciation of the body, they also risk something else. Christianity is sometimes able to break through that. This is heteronormativity, isn't it? But it risks the downplaying of the ordinary, the prosaic reproductive business of the race and the positive valuation of passion. So I'm not saying any's better than the other. They all have their difficulties here. So you don't regard Christianity as a revealed religion then. You don't think that following the teaching or example of Christ is the most important thing. You think that promoting your political agenda is the most important thing. And you're so convinced that you're right, you will even venture into other religions to try and shift their emphasis on heteronormativity because you're completely convinced that you're right. And obviously, I mean, the people who practice these religions, being inferior to you, wouldn't be able to practice and interpret their own religion themselves. They'd need a genius like you to do it for them, wouldn't they? You're absolutely hysterical. But it is quite funny, isn't it, that you were so obsessed that I just might be a lesbian, allegedly. And this would be a terrible thing, and I had to have my life completely destroyed and everybody treated me in a vile way, just in case I might be a lesbian. And yet your most important agenda seems to be shifting the norm of heteronormativity. Well, and it's just a complete coincidence that you'd previously tried to get your leg over. That won't have had anything to do with it, will it? Because obviously if I didn't fancy you, I must be a lesbian. There couldn't possibly be any other explanation, could there? And as I've said before, if you were an example of the male of the species, I've no doubt I would be a lesbian. In fact, I think the entire world would be populated by lesbians and straight men if you were an example of the male of the species. Anyway, I'll leave it there for now because I've been ranting on for quite a while, and I did have another substantial thing I wanted to say, but I'll leave that for my next video. So, have a nice day, and I'm sorry I didn't get to arrest you. I did see some lovely pictures of you on Twitter last night at St Paul's Cathedral, so I don't know if you managed to bilocate or not, but perhaps I'll find that out later today, and I'll make another video later on to comment on some of your bizarre outpourings on the subject of sexuality and sexual ethics. Hasta la próxima!
It's often said that the other Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Islam, don't have quite the same problems Christianity has about the body. And that's largely true. Judaism and Islam are less fastidious and anxious, less fussed about the body and passion than Christianity is, for a number of reasons which would take a long time to spell out. They don't have any deeply entrenched worry about the physical as such, and they don't seem so worried about letting go of that passion. So the positive valuation of sexual desire and sexual passion is very deeply there in lots and lots of Jewish writing and Islamic writing. The ideal of celibacy and the ideal of rational control of your sexuality are not given the same valuation in Judaism and Islam. The downside, because there's no such thing as a free lunch here, the downside is that in some ways Jewish and Islamic approaches to sexuality have been historically more deeply wedded to patriarchy and reproduction than Christianity is. Christianity, in spite of what some people say, especially in the Daily Mail, is not all about family values. In fact, early Christianity is often pretty sceptical about families. It doesn't necessarily have a huge investment in keeping the human race going. Judaism and Islam are much more interested in procreation, in reproduction of the race, for all sorts of reasons. But that can mean, in lots of historic Jewish and Islamic approaches, it can mean that what some people call by the terrifying title of heteronormativity, that is, heterosexual reproductive sex is the only thing, that is harder to shift in the context of Judaism or Islam than it might be in Christianity. I don't know, but that's one way of looking at it. Simply to say that although Judaism and Islam have, on the surface, a more positive appreciation of the body, they also risk something else. Christianity is sometimes able to break through that, but it risks the downplaying of the ordinary, the prosaic, reproductive business of the race and the positive valuation of passion. So I'm not saying any's better than the other. They all have their difficulties.